The Premier in late 2007. Premier Brad Wall joins us every single month, roughly every 4 to 6 weeks, on a feature we call Ask the Premier. It is your public accountability session. The Premier joins us in studio when we are in the same town. Otherwise, he'll often join us from the legislature, from his home office in Swift Current. Sometimes he's even joined us on the road on various official provincial business trips around the country. The Premier takes 1 hour, and he takes your calls on anything that you have on your mind today. Now, I always remember, and it's a good time to reflect back, that it was on this feature that we didn't take a call. It was actually a tweet from one of our gang, a sergeant at the Saskatoon Police Service, who simply asked the question, you have veterans' license plates in the province. Now, with a generation of veterans back from Afghanistan, we have a lot of veterans who ride. Why don't we have veterans' license plates? The Premier considered it for a moment, thought about it, and said, well, I don't see a reason we don't do it. Within days, Saskatchewan, as a result of Sergeant Pat Barber's tweet, Saskatchewan now has veterans' license plates on motorcycles. So these are the sorts of things that go on Ask the Premier. Lines are lighting up. There are many ways you can keep in touch. First of all, phone is best. You want to talk to the Premier, 1-877-332-8255, or text 306-306, name and town, please. Tweet, Facebook, however you want to keep in touch, your way of joining Ask the Premier. Premier Brad Wall now joins us from his home base in Swift Current in southwestern Saskatchewan. Premier, thanks for taking our call.
Hi, John.
Walk me through what the plans are post-Saskatchewan legislative sitting. You see the population numbers. Numbers are up impressive. Are you still on target as you start to look at the personal and the political benchmarks on population?
We're actually ahead of target, John. You might remember years before we were able to form government, we set out a goal for population growth in the province of about 1%. That was the national average, and it was our view at the time that this province, with all of its resources, with all we have going for us, should at least be aspirants to the national average of growth. You also might remember at the time that there were those who said that was actually statistically impossible, who actually were in government at the time.
Well, I was going to say, I hope you pin it on who it was. I mean, the NDP government at the time said this was an example why your predecessor, Elwyn Hermanson, was unfit to govern,
right? Because
how could you possibly believe you could grow the population by 1% a year?
Right. It was a goal, a numerical goal of 1.1 million people within 10 years, so 100,000 people within 10 years, and that works out to the 1%. That's the national average. We are far exceeding that now. The last numbers that came out yesterday, October to October, so October 11 to October 12, we've grown 23,024 people. By that amount of people who have come to this province, we're now at 1,086,000 5 years into the change, and so that's significantly ahead of schedule. It's also why, John, we set a new goal in the growth plan we released this fall just prior to the session, where we indicated that we think the goal should be 1.2 million people by 2020. And there were those. Here's how the province has changed for the better, I would say. If we were criticized with respect to that goal, it was because some thought the goal wasn't ambitious enough. So I think it really is a new day. Credit not to the government, credit to, yes, our resources, but most significantly the people we have here. There's been so many tweets I've read and stories in the media that the media have found those who either are expatriates who left, thought they would never come back, and are now here. Some have built their own businesses here. Some are working here, or young people who've stayed. We implemented the graduate retention plan. It was a promise we made in the 2007 election campaign. We think that's the most aggressive post-secondary graduate retention plan in the country. 58,000 young people have applied to stay. That's the one where they can earn their tuition back up to $20,000 if they'll stay in the province and work here. There needs to be opportunity for them to do that, but there also needs to be, I think, a mindset, a desire, a want to stay here, and that's what we see now, and that's credit to just a brand new attitude right across the province that I think is really a big part of the change that we've seen in Saskatchewan in the last number of years.
There is naturally in population, and as you've mentioned, a big international component, interprovincial, even just now that we have more people here, births minus deaths. We're winning on that count as well. So this is naturally the kind of growth that happens when you put more people in the room. But how do you sustain on a resource-based economy, which is going to be subject to the natural fluctuations, whether it's energy, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's food, how do you start to sustain it in a permanent way?
Oh, a couple of things. On the resource side, it is going to cycle. There's no question about it. But, John, I've been saying, and I think others who are more qualified in terms of some economists, I think, have alluded to this, that the floor prices for the natural resources that we produce may have changed permanently. I mean, when people now talk about a low in oil, that's a much higher low than it ever was before. Same is true for potash. The same is true for these other resources we have. We also have the information that comes out of the United Nations and others who've looked carefully at population growth around the world and the implications for the demand for food around the world over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That's also very, very strong. And of course, agriculture is again where we have a great leadership role to play, and the best farmers in the world, and there's long-term economics in that. So on the resource side, I think there's reason for optimism that while they'll cycle, they may cycle in a different way than they ever have to the benefit of our economy. The other thing, John, is I think there's been a real diversification of the economy. We're doing more manufacturing related to the resource sector here, whether it's the potash industry, whether it's oil. There are more servicing, not enough yet we'd like in the oil side of things, but more and more servicing in the industry that's here. We also are, as a government, trying to diversify towards the new economy, the innovation agenda. That's why we invest in the Global Food Security Institute with the Potash Corp, or the Dr. Sylvia Fedorik Nuclear Center for Innovation, or the Petroleum Research Center, to build on our resource strength, but build the next generation of jobs from those sectors related to innovation.
Premier Brad Wall is here. Lines are lighting up. Some good questions coming up. Also, as I check out Twitter and texts, queries as well. This is our December edition, final one of the year 2012. Ask the Premier. I'm John Gormley. This is News Talk Radio. I'm John Gormley. This is our final session of the calendar year 2012 of Ask the Premier. All right, let's go in the order you've been waiting. Lines have been brisk. Clayton in Regina, you're on with Premier Brad Wall.
Good morning, both of you. We've grain farmed just outside of Regina, and our taxes went from $600 a year to $4,200 a year. So basically, we got fined $3,600 for putting a house on the property. We have absolutely no amenities that the city people enjoy. We put absolutely everything in and borrowed every dime. Why do we have... The Sama people told us that we are being charged so much is because if we sold today, we would make so much money if we sold. What happens if the property prices drop? Will Sama drop our taxes? And why are we being fined such a high rate just because we're trying to make a living?
Sure. A couple of points here, if I can. One, we promised in 2007 to massively drop the education side of things. That's what the provincial government has responsibility for, the education mill rate on agricultural land, and we kept the promise to the extent where there has been, average farms can have saved up to 80% in what they used to be paying for education taxes at a much lower mill rate, just over 3 mills, I think, is now the province-wide rate for that particular class of land. There is currently a reevaluation going on across the province. It happens on a regular basis. The short answer is if property values drop, the taxes will also drop. The assessment will absolutely drop. But we have seen right across the province, since we've done since SAMA and other municipal assessment agencies have done their inspections, we've seen a massive increase, John, in the value of property, both farmland but also homes in towns and villages and certainly in the cities. That's going to be reflected in the tax bills that are happening right across the province at the local level. Because people are able to do more with that asset. Some have, taken the opportunity to refinance, perhaps, and there's a real value there for families and for businesses who've seen this asset just significantly increase in the last number of years. But the implication will be there with respect to taxes. Now, on this specific question, all I can say is from a provincial government, we have significantly reduced, as I've mentioned, the education portion of taxes on farmland. We've kept the promise that we had made in 2007, and for everybody. But it was a significant decrease in agriculture land because you remember, John, they were paying a disproportionately high level of education tax in the province before the changes that we made happened.
1-877-332-8255. Let me go both to tweets and texts. Okay, you want to talk about a finite amount of money. You've only got so much money you're going to put into highways. Can you ask the Premier about twinning Highway 16 east of Saskatoon as it heads to the Manitoba border? And then someone else says, can you ask the Premier about Highway 7 west of Saskatoon to Calgary? When will that be twinned?
I see on the Twitter there's a lot of action on Highway 7. I'm on that road often. Obviously, I live in Swift Current, and so anytime I'm driving to Saskatoon, which is often, that'll be the case here again, even in the next little while. 7 is busy, especially the time that you might be on that particular road. If you're there after in the evening, for example, on that stretch of highway, it's very busy. The ministry is looking at a number of options with respect to passing lanes. We want to see passing lanes deployed more aggressively right across the province. In the southeast corner of Saskatchewan, we've got some real pressure areas. They are looking at a twinning program, which of course is very expensive. We have accelerated twinning for the highway between Saskatoon and Prince Albert, and that's very nearly finished. These roads, these highways, these proposals, both 16 and 7, are part of the ongoing evaluation. But I think that people will see passing lanes as a starting point, and obviously we're not going to rule out twinning a very busy highways.
Mr. Premier is with us. Brad Wall, let's go back to the phones. Ari in Saskatoon, you're on with the Premier.
Good morning, gentlemen. Quick question for you. We made the right decision to support the gentleman, the refugee with cancer, and to cover his treatments. But I have a friend who's a Saskatchewan resident who needs an insulin pump, and it's not covered.
Well, okay, thanks for the call. The caller may remember in the last election we promised to expand coverage for insulin pumps and for certain other supplies related to diabetes for kids. And we have kept that promise. We are now covering the pumps, for example, for residents up to age 25. We are looking at other potential expansions down the road. And so I hope that the caller sees progress being made there, because the commitment we made and kept since the last election is obviously a significant improvement for families who are having to pay for all the costs of the pump and supplies on their own.
Premier Brad Wall, let's go to Prince Albert now. Caller Kerry. Kerry, you're on with the Premier.
Good morning, Mr. Premier. I'm the chairman of the board of directors for one of the SARC member agencies, and I just want to thank you and your government for allowing us to remain competitive with our workforce by giving us promising us the just over $17 million in funding for wages for our employees.
Okay, now just to explain that, the SARC, this is the Association of Rehabilitation Centers?
Right.
Okay.
It is, John, and it's SARC and a number of other CBOs across the province who are caring for our most vulnerable citizens. There's no question about it, and for a very long time we've been hearing from them as they struggle to compete with health regions, with sometimes other care facilities, even the school system. They're competing for these amazing staff, amazing people who have a passion to work with those who have disabilities, who are the most vulnerable among us. And they've been struggling because of the wages they're able to offer as community-based organizations relative to these other organizations. So June Droughty, the Minister of Social Services, announced this week $17.3 million to invest in these CBOs so they can bring the wages up of these amazing workers, so that they can be a little bit more competitive and keep them train more, have them working in this very important area.
Premier Brad Wall with us. Premier, a couple other questions coming up. One of our listeners on health, doctor recruitment. Okay, one question that I've asked you in the past here, and you did get the health department to report back, although the mayors of both Saskatoon and Regina, just the other day on the show, said their preference, because we hand out 4.7 million needles a year in needle exchanges, nobody's got a problem with needle exchanges. It's just tracking, the origin of the needles, because in some public health worlds they say, well, we recover all the needles, but it must be other people throwing needles around. So the answer is, if you went with a colored plunger, again, it has nothing to do with the efficacy of the needle. The needle's still a needle, but it would allow in communities people to know these are publicly distributed and paid for needles. What is your thought on that?
Well, I think we've already answered the question, John, and I would ask you, what did the mayor say?
Both of the mayors have said they would like colored plungers on needles being distributed by health regions, because that way, at the different needle exchanges in both Saskatoon and Regina, they would know which are the publicly funded needles.
Well, that might be helpful in this discussion to have the minister contact the mayors, because and they may well have, the mayors may well have expressed that to the minister or other officials or the health region in the past, but I'm not aware of it, and so this will be, I think this is an important development that the minister and the ministry can contact those mayors and see what their thoughts are on that.
That would be great. I thank you for that. Perhaps Dustin Duncan's people can get a hold, because yes, both Don Atchison and Michael Foucher made that statement here last week. Dean in Alameda, while we're on health care, you have a question on doctor recruitment.
Yes, we're in an area in rural Saskatchewan where we need 5 doctors. We only have 2, and they're run ragged. Is there going to be anything done to alleviate the problem there? And the immigration standards on the doctors that have been coming over have been running into some real cement blocks, and I just wondering if there was some way we could ease that up to kind of help them guys do the paperwork a little bit faster and get them moved into these rural areas.
Thanks for that question. A couple things. We have, first and foremost, we've expanded the number of training seats to train more doctors here at the University of Saskatchewan. We have significantly increased those from about 60 on the way to about 100 seats. We've also doubled the number of residency positions, so training seats for people in studying medicine here in the province who take the next step into residency. There was 60 when we formed government. We committed to double it, and we're there now at about 120 because we need to train more doctors here. We also need to be and are working on being much more aggressive in recruiting the doctors that we do train here, so that they're not trained in the province and then lured elsewhere. The other thing we did in the first term is that we've expanded the list of countries from which we can accept foreign-trained doctors, and brought home the assessment process, which is what the caller is referencing there. We used to have a process called CAPE. I think it was administered out of Manitoba for these foreign-trained doctors to move through. We now have a rigorous, because we obviously have to be very careful in terms of standard of care, but we have a Saskatchewan assessment process there for doctors to move through. There's results. We now have 284 more doctors practicing in Saskatchewan than we did when we took over office. Granted, there needs to be more. That's why the doctor recruitment agency was in India recently, for example. They had meetings, and over 400 physicians attended the sessions that our team put on. And they're now going to be evaluating those foreign-trained doctors. We are going to be very aggressive in trying to deal with the issue, whether you're in Alameda or in Kipling, for example. That's where the call came from last time, John. It's an issue, and that's why we are moving to train more here, to keep the ones we train here, but also to open up to more foreign-trained doctors.
Mr. Premier, stand by.
On very aggressive missions around the world.
Stand by. Back with Premier Brad Wall on Ask the Premier here on News Talk Radio. Calendar year 2012 of what we call Ask the Premier. Phone lines are busy. Lots of action on Twitter. Text 306-306, and we will try and get every one of your questions answered. Premier, just as a quick follow, you mentioned doctor recruitment, and you mentioned Kipling, and I should have asked you this earlier. Normally, if you are unable to find certain answers, you bring back a story. Kipling and doctors was one of the issues last month, wasn't it?
It sure was. Both the facility there, they need a new facility, and the doctors there. Good news on the facility front. The tender, the project went to tender at the end of November. That's an integrated facility, so long-term care integrated with acute care, and construction is expected to begin in May of next year. So that'll help attract a doctor there, because that's where the news isn't quite as good. We are working through the region to make sure there's coverage But this is one of those communities where there's been a bit of a perfect storm, and there's a real lack of a real shortage of doctors there right now. So Sun Country Health Region is engaging the Regina Qu'Appelle Health Region to shore up some of the services there. And overall, as I mentioned, we have 284 more doctors here in the province over the last over the past 5 years versus what had been there before. But there's more work to be done, and the people of Kipling and area would be the first ones to agree with that. So good news on the facility, and we're making slow progress with respect to doctor coverage there.
Just looking, texting 306, Tyson in North Battleford. In regard to the Saskatchewan Hospital, will it ever be replaced, and is it going to be built in North Battleford?
Yes and yes. We made that announcement now prior to the last election. The planning dollars immediately flowed, I think, $5 million, so we can get the project planned correctly. It is very, very important, obviously, to the province, and it's important to that city, and it's going to stay there. The whole area of mental health is going to is coming into focus, has for some time here, and you're going to see more of a focus on it as we move forward. Not just the hospital itself, but improving community access to mental health and ensuring there's community residence options for those who are patients that can live in communities still. And so there's more work to be done, but the hospital will be built. It'll be built in North Battleford.
I want to just run over a couple of things post-legislative sitting. You and I had a quick chat right after the ledge rose in early December. There was, of course, the Saskatchewan Employment Act, this comprehensive bill where you're going to roll in 12 existing statutes. Walk us through what the timeline looks like now. You had the consultation. The bill was presented late in the proceedings of the legislature, and it is to be debated and passed in the spring. What is the further public consultation on that labor law?
Well, sure. People now can comment on the bill. Obviously, all the parts of it are known. The minister has clearly said there may be unintended consequences from this significant consolidation of existing legislation, and people now have the opportunity to provide more comment, offer their concerns, offer their questions before it gets into the spring sitting where it'll be again debated and then finally passed. There may be amendments. I wouldn't be surprised if there are amendments, because we've said all along we're going to keep an open mind throughout the process, and that's exactly what's going to happen.
Now, the other major matter that arose in the House, the status of ISC, the government's Information Services Corporation. I think a lot of people remember the old land titles days when ISC, the subject of a lot of scandal back in the early 2000s, the last government spent about 60 to 70 million, in fact, close to $100 million. They finally got ISC running. It has been a commercial corporation, but government-owned. What is your plan with that?
It's a great company. We think it can expand beyond our borders. We think there's other business it can do while being permanently headquartered here in the province, and we think adding jobs. In order for it to do that, it needs capital, and frankly, other governments that would like to do something with their land titles have signaled they don't want to deal with another government, i.e. a crown. They'd like to deal with a private company. And to underscore the point, John, the NDP in Manitoba have just announced that they're privatizing their land titles, their property registry. They're going to they're not doing a share offering to employees and to the people as we're going to do. They're just selling it outright to an Ontario company called Terranet. Terranet was formed when the Ontario government privatized their land titles. So it really makes the point. Here you have the NDP government in Manitoba saying, we think the service can be delivered in another way, and they're actually going to contract with an Ontario company to do it. For us, we want to actually see ISC strengthened. We want it to be able to compete for those kinds of contracts here in Canada and potentially beyond the borders of the country, and to grow and expand as a world-class land titles company headquartered here in Saskatchewan.
Now, what is the timeline on that? Again, the bill was introduced in the fall, which, of course, under the rules here, imply it'll be passed in the spring. A, if that happens. B, what then happens with a share issue?
The bill passes, and then we'll carefully look at the market, because we want to maximize value for the taxpayers. The other advantage of this plan is that between $80 and $90 million will be available for selling just 60% of the company in a share offering to employees and the people of the province and the country. So the government will retain 40%, And with that $90 million, we intend on moving that over to Sask Builds. That's the new infrastructure vehicle for government. You have a lot of tweets and a lot of calls on highways and on the need for infrastructure. Well, that $90 million can be put to long-term use here in the province in terms of important infrastructure. And if the market's right, the share offering can happen this spring. But again, to your question of timing, there may be a delay if we're advised that, look, another market time might be better to maximize value and increase the amount of money we'd have for long-term infrastructure.
Premier Brad Walls here. This is our December edition of Ask the Premier. Back to the phones now. Ian in Regina. Ian, a question on immigration.
Yes, we have a construction company locally, and we've been looking to Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program to attempt to grow our business. But instead of coming out and telling us that they're out of quota and that we're going to have to wait, they're going out of their way to find any little reason to decline any applicant that we put forward and clear their desk. I need help growing my business. I'm sick of looking at Alberta and BC trucks doing my work. What kind of plan do you have to get the feds to give us more quota so we can get the guys in that we need and get rid of this shortage?
Well, the quota is at 4,000 right now, and you've probably heard us saying that needs to increase. In fact, in our growth plan, we released it this fall, we indicated that we need the federal government to approve a significant increase to the cap on the number of nominees. That's what we're talking about here, John, from 4,000 to 6,000. We haven't heard a final word on that yet, but it's very, very important that we see this progress happen for the reasons that have just been mentioned in terms of a barrier to growth for our own companies, for our own economy. I can tell you this, since the election of 2007, there's been a real change. We've really focused on the issue of immigration. From 2001 to 2006, there was about 8,000 newcomers that were welcomed to the province of Saskatchewan. From 2007 until the present, 39,000. So real progress being made in terms of a greater focus on immigration, improvements to the nominee program. But obviously, I'm hearing right now we need to do more. But if the caller and others can contact a federal member of parliament and say, look, our economy's growing, we need this increase in the cap on nominees, we need it quickly. And by the way, John, one final point on that. I've said to the Prime Minister, look, if there's any additional cost to the federal government for this cap increase, Saskatchewan will pay. So here's a no-cost way for the federal government to help Saskatchewan continue to contribute to the national economy.
Jason Kenney, though, the last time he was on this program, didn't sound very receptive.
No, they haven't been very receptive yet. I'm still hopeful. We have some of the best settlement rates in Canada. The other part of the case we make to the federal government is when we ask for this increase is that we actually have better retention rates than the federal government does in terms of their category. There's two categories here, John. We should be clear. There's a provincial nominee program, and that's what we're talking about right now, where the province is very much involved, and we can always be improving as well. Then there's the federal portion. So federal immigrants to the country who come to Saskatchewan, who choose here. 9 out of 10 of our newcomers, of our immigrants, come through the nominee program. We only get 1 out of 10 that come from the federal process. So that's why we're hopeful when the federal government announces another 3,000 skills-based, economic-based immigrants that we'll be able to improve that number and get some of those 3,000.
Premier Brad Wallace here. Stand by. Back with more of your questions. This is our final edition of the year 2012 Ask the Premier. I'm John Gormley, and this is News Talk Radio. John Gormley, Premier Brad Wallace here. This is our regular monthly to every 6 weekly affair called Ask the Premier. Your questions to Premier Wall. Okay, back to the tweets. Chris tweets, any plan to light provincial highways to bedroom communities like Martinsville or Warman north of Saskatoon?
We are working on that. We're working with the Highways Ministry is looking at that very carefully, that option for Highway 12. So nothing specific to announce. But that's a real possibility. What's happening around Saskatoon is pretty amazing. If you go to those communities and right around any of the communities right around Saskatoon are growing, and the traffic is certainly these are very busy highways, and lighting seems to be something that we should be looking very carefully at, and we will.
I want to bring you back to an issue, and it came up in the immigration context. A guy who's talked about his building experience, but in general, I mean, immigration, as you mentioned, 39,000, you said, international immigrants?
39,000 newcomers, right, since 07.
Okay, so that's virtually half our immigration then, right? Because we're up about 85,000.
Right.
So half are international. But the labor shortage in general, I mean, the reason we've moved to so many international people and they've moved here is there's opportunities. But even domestically in Canada, Ken Kravetz, most recently when he was talking, the federal finance minister, Jim Flaherty, is talking about this. So you've got labor, other issues in central Canada, where you've got people looking for work. Here, I mean, just how acute in terms of the number of jobs we need to fill is the challenge that we're going to be facing in the next couple of years?
Well, in the growth plan, we identify the need for 60,000 more workers by 2020. That might be a little bit light, but that's the number that we've come up with, we've developed, and that means we're going to need all hands on deck. So our approach to this has been always threefold. The first priority has to be greater engagement by people who live in this province today. We have Aboriginal unemployment at a rate that's much higher than for non-Aboriginals, which isn't acceptable at any time, but it's most assuredly not acceptable at a time of economic growth. We've seen some progress there. We've been investing in training. We've partnered with excellent institutions like the Saskatchewan Indian Institute for Technology, and just over the last 5 years, for example, since November of 07, we see an increase of Aboriginal employment by 9%, about 3,300, but we need to do better on that front. We need to work hard to promote this province in the rest of the country, to get expatriates and other Canadians to come. On that front, we also need to be lobbying our federal government for continued improvements to employment insurance so there are not disincentives for Canadians living in other parts of the country from moving to where there is opportunity. And finally, we need to continue to be aggressive in terms of immigration, international immigration. It's how this province was built in the first place. It's at the core of our motto, from many people's strength, but we're going to need all three of these, all three sources working for us to deal with the labor shortage.
I want you to look ahead, Premier, to 2013. You reflect back. You're reelected late 2011, so 2012 really becomes your first full year of the second mandate. So you're a quarter of the way through now on a second term. What are some of the look-ahead challenges for you?
Well, the way our legislature works, and you've already referenced it, John, you have a fall sitting where bills are introduced, and then in the spring they're finally passed. So there are some changes that we'll see. We announced in the fall that will come to fruition in the spring. We've talked about the new employment code. We've talked about ISC. This year we're going to see new private liquor stores through a competitive process built in areas where in the past we would have just put up more government stores. That's a major change. In terms of the broader strokes, you're going to see us continue to implement the growth plan that we announced in the fall. The growth plan is intended to sustain the economic growth, to do what governments can do to get out of the way of it and to facilitate it, to deal with the labor shortage, to focus on training. But also, we want to ensure that we're dealing with the challenges that come along with growth on the infrastructure side, on housing. So, not a lot of surprises coming up this year, John. If people are aware of the growth plan of the government and have seen what we've done, in these first 5 or so years, they ought not to be surprised about 2013.
Okay, Angus Reid poll, the 3 words that come out regularly. You're the only premier in the country with a popularity rate over 50%, which I think says bad things about some of your colleagues. You are still in that range of 60%. Is it 60%? Yeah. So when you look at that kind of popularity rating, what's the take-home message for you?
I think a reporter from your network, I think by the name of Sarah Mills, asked quite pointedly yesterday, look, the 67% really isn't that high, so aren't you just sort of the least of a pretty bad bunch, or the best of a pretty bad bunch? And Sarah, has got a great way of putting questions, and I told her I'd somehow get that out, and now I've just done that. I've said, John, many times, I'll say it again, I think Angus Reid oversamples my mom and dad, because I only was ever at about 67% when I lived with them.
Yeah, 2/3. I guess you're batting 670. Be some good career winning stats on that.
We are very fortunate. Our government has been very fortunate. I always try to point that out. We benefited from a lot of good fortune, and that's going to have an impact politically, I guess. So I think that's important for us to remember that it isn't the government that's growing this economy; it's the people that are doing it, and our resources that are doing it, and we benefit from that. But we'll try to keep our head down and do the things that I think government can do to stay out of the way of that growth, as I mentioned, and hopefully facilitate it where we can.
Mr. Premier, I really appreciate you doing this, and thanks for this session every month. Merry Christmas to you and Tammy and the family, and we'll see you in 2013.
Merry Christmas to you, John, to Marie, and all your listeners, and thanks very much.
Premier Brad Wall with us, as he is every single month on Ask the Premier. I'm John Gormley. Next, the hour of the big...